do this right now. I'm doing a workshop for you about styling React applications, and I'll walk you through the journey and the history of how we styled React applications. And I want you to code along. So there's a repo, which you have to git clone, and you have to run npm install. Since you're a bunch of people and you're all going to be running npm install at the same time, please do it now, rather than when I tell you to do the workshop, so it's done by then. I want to take you on a journey, as I said, through the history of how we were styling React applications. I have some slides here, which you can find as well. So if you want to follow along with the slides, go to this URL and you'll see the slides, and you can follow along and see what happens. So my name is Max. I come from beautiful Vienna, Austria, not Australia. That's not quite the same thing. I'm from Europe, not from the other end of the world. I'm here today to talk to you about React and how we style React applications. Due to the way of how React works, everything is very encapsulated, right? The core part of React is components. Everything in React is a component. Everything is inherently encapsulated. And the issue that people have begun discovering as they've been building more and more React apps is that CSS doesn't quite work very well with that model, right? Because CSS inherently is global, and components inherently are locally scoped. So the React community has started, trying out different things and trying to figure out how we can make CSS work a bit better for our use case. I made a checklist of things that we kind of want from CSS, really, right? Or from any solution that adapts CSS for our use case. This checklist has these items, right? No build requirements. I don't want to have an extra build step just to compile my CSS. I don't really care about that. Whatever solution we use should be small and lightweight. It should support global CSS. So if we start locally scoping CSS, some things still need to be global, right? Like a reset, a browser reset. That still needs to be global. So that should still be possible. It should support the entirety of CSS, which, looking at this list, seems a bit weird, but you'll see why that's really relevant very soon. And then the important parts are that it's co-located and isolated, right? If I style a component a certain way, I want that component to always look the same. I don't want it to be affected by anything outside of that component. It should be isolated as much as possible, and very often that will require co-location of styles. And then there's also a bunch of other properties like being easy to override, being themable, having server-side rendering, and not creating any wrapper components that are more library specific. The thing about this checklist is that there's no all-green solution, right? This checklist I'm totally made up. That's my wish list for what I wish CSS would look like. There's nothing exists at the moment which has everything green. Thank you. Which is an important note to make because there's always trade-offs. Whatever you choose to style your React applications has trade-offs and it has limitations. And it does certain things, but it also doesn't do other things, right? A library is defined just as much by what it does as by what it doesn't do, right? So it's always important to keep that in mind. There's no all-green solution. Choose what you need based on your requirements, right? I can't tell you what your requirements in your app are, right? You need to think about that and figure out what you want and what you need based on your team, on your app, on your users, everything. Yeah. I made a tiny example to showcase the different things we'll be using. It's very small. It renders a single tweet. The styling is blatantly stolen from Twitter, obviously. This is just a page that I made, and I styled it in a bunch of different ways, right? So it's structured in components. We have, and it's responsive, of course, if you can see it. It's structured in a bunch of different components. We have an app component, which is more the general component, and then we have a tweet component, which renders a single tweet. Nothing special happening there. And then that tweet component is split into 3 more components. The tweet component has a header, a content, and a footer component, which all do, their own thing. These are the 4 methods I want to talk about today, right? I've styled the same thing in 4 different ways, and I want to show you what that looks like and what that means for the components. So the first one is CSS, right? Just plain vanilla CSS, nothing special going on, right? I'm sure you've all seen CSS before, and this is cut off at the top, so I'll move that down. How do I do this? Sorry about that. Can't. Anyways, you'll have to trust me that there's something at the top. So this is just vanilla CSS, right? We have a class name, we have a media query, we have some styling. There's nothing special going on. You've all seen this before. Then we style our tweet component. We have a tweet content. We style some links inside of our tweet component, our tweet content. This is an important note because what you see here is nesting. Since we don't know what our tweet content will render, since the content is user-based, we can't just put a special class name on every anchor. We just have to style every anchor within that content. But again, this is just CSS, right? You've all seen this before. Nothing special happening here. And then to use it, we just put class name into our React components, right? We've all seen this before. We've all seen classes before. There's nothing special going on here. So let's take a look at the checklist for CSS, right? This is plain CSS, and it's pretty green if you look at it, right? It doesn't have any build requirements. It's the smallest and most lightweight it could be. It supports global CSS, obviously. It supports the entirety of CSS, obviously. It is CSS. It's not co-located, and it's not isolated, but it's easy to override. It does server-side rendering fairly well, and it doesn't have any wrapper components. Theming is a bit of a wonky situation in CSS because theming will be very great very soon with custom properties, but those aren't supported in all the browsers yet, so it's kind of like, yeah, we'll have good theming very soon, but not right now. So the thing about styling your applications differently with a library or with CSS and JS or with inline styles, the two things we always want to achieve is co-location and isolation, right? As you can see, CSS is a pretty green checklist. And all the libraries that exist try to give you co-location and isolation while keeping as much of the other stuff green as well, right? Again, it's about trade-offs. If you don't care about co-location and isolation, if you're fine with having a global CSS file and you don't ever run into CSS bugs, then you're perfectly fine. So when people started building React applications like 3 years ago, they realized that co-location and isolation would be kind of nice to have. So what they started doing is they started using inline styles, because inline styles are bound to a DOM node, right? What do inline styles look like? Well, they're just JavaScript objects, right? In React, we can say const styles equals an object, then we say container, and that sort of has this CSS-like syntax of margin 0 auto, width 100%. We do the same thing for our tweet content component. The difference here is that inline styles, as you might notice, don't support anything like nesting or hovering or any pseudo selectors. So the big downside of inline styles, as we see, is it doesn't support all of CSS. But anyways, let's go on. The way to use it is to just say style equals styles.content or styles.media or styles.image, right? And these styles are now bound to that DOM node, right? These are inherently local. Nothing can override those styles anymore, which is pretty great. Like we have co-location and we have isolation out of the box. This is what gets generated from that object, right? So we have a paragraph tag with a style attribute that has a bunch of CSS in it. Now this works pretty good. This works pretty well. It gives us co-location and isolation, right? Inline styles are inherently very co-located and very isolated. You can't override them, and they're bound to the specific DOM node. The issue is that you can't have global CSS, and it doesn't not even nearly support the entirety of CSS. Inline styles don't support pseudo selectors like hover or active or checked or anything. They support nesting. They support a bunch of stuff. Media queries don't work. They don't support a bunch of stuff that we expect and like from CSS. They're also not easy to override, and they also don't have any theming support. So a bunch of people sort of got around this whole inline style thing and started styling everything inline, but quickly realized the limitation of not having support for the entirety of CSS, right? How do you do hover styling? Hover styling you can alias in JavaScript, right? You can do an on mouse over and on mouse out. But then what do you do with the checked selector? How do you make a checked selector in JavaScript? So you have to keep track of the state in JavaScript, and like you can't alias everything in JavaScript. So people started looking towards other solutions. One of the big ones that came out was CSS modules. What CSS modules does is it allows you to write standard CSS, but then scopes it to a specific component. So if we look at the code for CSS modules, this looks oddly familiar, right? CSS modules looks just like vanilla CSS. There's nothing special going on. You're literally just writing CSS. And then if you look at our tweet content, it looks the exact same as our vanilla CSS example, except we don't do the tweet __ content thing anymore because we don't need to. And the reason for that is that CSS module scopes are class names. So what we do with CSS modules is which you can't see here because it's cut off. What we do is we import styles from /content.css, and then we say class name equals styles.content. Right? So we kind of import a CSS file into our JavaScript file, and then assign the class names we had in that CSS file to our React DOM nodes, which is very weird at the beginning, but what CSS modules does under the hood is it takes those class names we had and scopes them, right? It makes them totally unique. CSS modules takes that .content class name and makes it unique. And the special thing is, if you have a second .content class name anywhere in your application, it'll end up having a different class name in the end. Meaning, they don't override, they don't clash, right? They're scoped to a specific component, which is super great because as a developer, I don't have to care about writing specific BEM notation or ACSS or SMAC CSS or anything. I don't have to worry about naming. I just name the things the way I want them to name. I want to name them, and CSS module just makes them unique. So CSS modules got us very far, right? It got us isolation, really good isolation, and it supported global CSS, entirety of CSS, it's small and lightweight. The downside of CSS modules is that it requires a specific build process, right? You have to use Webpack, and you have to use a specific loader for your CSS file, and everything has to be set up correctly. It's also not really co-located. It's co-located in the sense that it's next to the component file, but if I were to share that file to NPM, people wouldn't be able to get the CSS, right? They would also have to have that specific build process with Webpack and style loader and CSS loader and have everything set up the same way as I do, just to use my third-party component, which is super annoying. So at ThinkMill, we made this component library called Elemental UI that you might have heard of. And Elemental UI, we styled with less, and we styled with CSS modules. And the issue we ran into is that we published it to NPM, but for people to use it, they had to NPM install less, and then they had to set up Webpack, and then they had to do all of this loader stuff, and then they had to set everything up correctly just so they could use our button. That's stupid. Like, they shouldn't have to go through all of those hoops just to render a button, right? So that's where styled components comes in. Michael Chan has this great quote in one of his articles where he says, if you're writing React, you have access to a more powerful styling construct than CSS class names. You have components. And that is very much the crux of why styled components exists, right? So styled components is a library that myself and a friend, Glenn Mattern, made specifically for our use case of Elemental UI, and then eventually it sort of developed into a solution that just worked for everything. So the idea behind styled components is to put actual CSS in your JavaScript. To explain what that means, I have to explain the difference between inline styles and CSS in JS, right? So inline styles we saw before, we write our styles in an object and then say p_style equals styles. Now there's libraries out there that let you write styles in JavaScript just like inline styles, but they compile down to actual CSS. So rather than attaching style attributes to your DOM nodes, you still attach class names, and then that style object gets compiled to an actual CSS string and injected into the head of the DOM as a style tag. This means that you can write your styles in JavaScript, but still have access to the full power of JavaScript, right? Because you're injecting actual CSS, you can use hover selectors, you can use media queries, you can use check selectors, you can use everything, just everything that CSS supports. So styled components actually write actual CSS in JavaScript, which is pretty weird. So it looks like this. You import style from styled components, and then you say const title equals style.h1. And this is where it starts getting weird, because this style.h1 thing is a function that returns a React component that renders an h1 DOM node, right? So our title variable here is now a React component that renders an h1 DOM node. It renders a heading. That's fine and all, but then we do this weird backtick thing and pass in actual CSS. This weird backtick thing is an ES6 JavaScript feature. This is not something we invented. This is a thing that JavaScript now has, and it's called tagged template literals. So you know how you can call functions with parentheses, right? And like how you always call functions? Well, you can now also call functions with backticks, which is pretty weird. It doesn't make any difference to you. It makes a difference in how the function is called. I won't get into that. If you want to look that up, Google tag template literals. But so essentially, we're calling the style.h1 function with a string of CSS. And then our title variable here is a React component that renders an h1 DOM node with that styling applied. Our wrapper is just a styled section, so it'll render an HTML section tag, and with those styles applied. So it'll have a background of papaya whip, a color of pale violet red, a padding of 4 AM, etc., etc. If you render these in our browser, just like any other React component, what you'll see is that we have a section and we have an h1, and the section has a papaya whip background, and the h1 has a color of pale violet red, and it's exactly what it says, right? It's what it says on the tin. So that's what styled components looks like. Styled components is a bunch of very nice features that make it different from some other libraries. The big one is adapting based on props. So you know how you have in React, you very often use props to adapt your components. So here in this example, we have a button, and then we have a primary button. So if we look at this in the browser, we have nothing, because the Wi-Fi doesn't load. Come on, Wi-Fi. Now that you're all npm installing, it doesn't want to do it anymore. No. I've got a local copy of it, though. So in our button, can you see this? This is super wonky, excuse the wonkiness. In our button, we can interpolate a function and adapt our styling based on the properties of the component, right? So in this case, we say our button, if the primary property is set, should have a background of pale violet red and a color of white. And if it's not set, it should have a background of white and a color of pale violet red, so the exact other way around, right? So if we render two buttons in our browser, a normal and the primary one, what you'll get is a normal and the primary button, surprisingly. Style components also has theming built in. So I'll skim over this because you won't need it in the lab. So we have the theme provider component that you can use. You can define a theme and then wrap your app in a theme provider. And what happens is all of your components can now adapt their styling based on the theme. So our button can say, hey, my background should be whatever the primary theme color is, right? And whatever the primary theme color is set to, our button will now have as a background. So in this case, we'll just set it to the same one as before, but we could also have multiple themes. So we could have a red theme and a green theme, and our button wouldn't need to change. The only thing that changes is our theme, which is very nice. Theme providers, because they use React context, also work across however many layers of components and DOM nodes you want. So what that essentially means is, what I'm trying to show here is, you can wrap specific parts of your app in different themes. So let's say you have like a main area and the sidebar. The sidebar can have a black theme and the main area can have a white theme, and your components don't need to know that, right? They're just rendered in the main theme and in the main area and in the sidebar, and they will adapt based on which environment they're rendered in. It also has full React Native support, which is cool if you're using React Native. It looks the exact same way, except it uses the React Native primitives. Blah, blah, blah. And then this is the checklist for styled components. It looks pretty green, which is kind of unfair because I made that checklist. So obviously it will be very green. But it ticks a lot of the boxes that I need, right? The thing we needed at ThinkMill were these couple of boxes, and it ticks almost all of them apart from the no wrapper components, because there's lots of wrapper components. But it doesn't have any build requirements. It's pretty small and lightweight. It supports global CSS. It supports the entirety of CSS. It's co-located. It's totally isolated. It's easy to override. There's theming and perfect server-side rendering support. But it has wrapper components, right? Which is a trade-off I'm fine with. So now I want you to experiment with these different approaches. So if you haven't set up the repo, now would be the time to do it. do a git clone, github.com/mxstbr/styling workshop, and do an npm install. If you've already done that, you should see an app running, right? And I'll do this now. So I'm in my, I can't zoom in. All right, so you should have, this is the same repo that you have. So if I do this is the same exact repo that you just set up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run yarn run. Actually, I'm going to run npm run start to start the app. This is all based on create React app. So if you've used create React app before, you've seen this before. And this will open a small demo app, which shows some weather data in a plot. Now this app, if you've just cloned the repo, this app is styled with vanilla CSS, right? There's a global.css file which contains all the styling to make the app look the way it does. And what I want you to do is to rework that styling with the different methods. So if we look at this app now, we go to localhost 3000. We have a beautiful app that does nothing except show a plot, right? Nothing fancy going on. We literally don't have anything apart from a heading and a plot, and that's it, pretty much. If we resize this, the whole thing is also responsive, and it shows a warning. So if I go into mobile mode, and I refresh, you'll see that it shows this warning that people should rotate their phones because a plot doesn't look great on a small phone. And that's basically it. Now this whole thing is styled with a global CSS file. So if we look at our public folder, there's a global.css file which contains all of the styling for the app, right? So we have some stylings, we have some wrappers, some titles, we have some after elements, and then we style the plot and the SVG, and we have a media query here to show the message on mobile. And that's basically it. It's just a couple of lines of styling. And your first challenge is to move them to inline styles, right? So if we open a new tab here, oh my God, how to do this? No. Yeah, that's what I want. No, that's not what I want. This is what I get for switching to Windows. Projects, workshops, styling. So if I do a git checkout inline styles, I've pre-configured a branch that deleted all the styling. So if we look at it after it's recompiled, you'll see that it doesn't look like anything, right? There's absolutely no styling applied. If you look into our editor, though, we'll see that all of our React components now have style tags. And your job is to make the application look the same way, except built with inline styles. All right? So I'll give you 10 minutes to make that happen, and then we'll take a look at it together. All right, let's try this again. Raise your hand if you're done. A couple of people, not too many. Let me walk you through it. If you started trying to do this, you might have noticed that a lot of stuff doesn't work, right? If we look at our global.css file, we see that we have a bunch of stuff that we can't do in inline styles, right? It starts off with the body, which we set to background color of FA, and a bunch of other stuff. We can't do that with inline styles. Inline styles don't have global CSS support, right? So that's out. Then we have a wrapper component, a wrapper class name. This we can do with inline styles. So if we look at our index.js, with the wrapper here, the wrapper has these styles. I'll just copy and paste them and say const styles equals an object wrapper. And then I just got to make this object syntax, which looks like this. Oops. Right, just make it valid JavaScript rather than CSS. And then on here, I just say div style equals styles.wrapper. Wrapper. Right, so our wrapper will have some styling. So if we now look at our app again, as soon as it recompiles, I get, oops, I have a typo somewhere, styles.wrapper. we see that our wrapper has a max width now. So before it was full width, now it has a max width. So that worked. So our wrapper now has styling. So then we got to style our heading. That also works. Our title, which is text align center, margin bottom 2 AM. So I add a title here. Title, text align center, margin bottom 2 AM, I think. And what was the third rule? Font size 1.5 AM. So I set all of that and put that down here as styles.title. And again, when that recompiles, you'll see that our title looks the way it did before almost. Bam, it's aligned in the center and it has a font size of 1.5 em. Now the issue is that it has the wrong font. That's because we don't have any global styles, right? In the global styles, we set this to be sans serif. Now we can't do that, so obviously it looks wrong. If we look in our dev tools, we can see that we now have the inline styles here. So it literally is a style attribute. And then we look further in our global.css file, and then we stumble upon the next thing that we can't do, which is after elements, right? Inline styles don't have after. Like, you can't have pseudo selectors. So that's out. We can't do that. And then we have this plot wrapper here, which is a width of 100%, which is in plot.js. So we go const styles, do the same thing. Wrapper, width, 100%. There's nothing fancy going on here. If you go down here, we just say styles.wrapper. But that's pretty much the extent of the things that we can do with inline styles, right? With inline styles, we're limited to anything, to any sort of basic rule, right? Even the nesting thing we can't do. Like, we can't say that the first thing should have a different background color. And media queries you can't do in inline styles either, right? So out of our 50 lines of CSS, we maybe are able to move 20 over to inline styles, right? And the rest we would have to alias in JavaScript, which is obviously not optimal. So as a next step, let's move to CSS modules instead, right? So if I commit this, because I fix all the styling, almost, and I'm going to check out CSS. I can't type modules. So in the CSS modules branch, we have a much better chance, right? Because CSS modules supports everything that CSS does. So rather than saying div class name equals something global here, we have to give it a local class name. Let's create a new file called, what do we want to call that? Probably general.css, because I can't come up with a better name right now. And now the funny thing is that we can pretty much just copy and paste our whole global.css file, paste it in here, right? I literally just copy and pasted the whole global.css file. I didn't change anything, I didn't do anything special. And all I do now up here is I say import styles from /global or general.css. And then down here I say class name equals styles.wrapper, I think it was, and class name equals styles.title, right? So our CSS stayed the exact same, but if I look in my browser, hopefully as it refreshes, we have a much better looking application already, right? Because now I literally just copy and pasted the CSS. The one thing I need to do now is also do that in plot.js and import up here. And say import styles from general.css. And then on here I say styles. What was the class name again? Plot-wrapper? Yeah. So I say styles plot-wrapper. And now this will have the right background. And now all that's missing is our global styling. And CSS modules has a special mode for that. So our body styles aren't applied, but what we can do here is we can say global, I think that's the right syntax. Can somebody correct me if this is wrong? No, apparently no one can. Let's look it up. I haven't used CSS modules in a while, so. But they have a syntax for specifying global CSS, which I think is :global. If the Wi-Fi would work, I could actually look it up. And the nice thing about CSS modules is, as you just saw, I literally just copy and pasted the global.css file, right? But contrary to before, my styles are now scoped to a component, right? Because the class names are now unique if you look in our DevTools, rather than having global class names, I now have completely unique class names that can't collapse, that can't clash. Why don't I have any class names? What? Where are my class names? What is going on? I did write that, right? I said styles.wrapper, class name. Oh, because I have to restart Webpack, that's why. Because I'm not very smart. That's why. Anyway, the nice thing about CSS modules is that I literally just copy, I write the same CSS that I would always write, but rather than assigning a global class name, I import my CSS file and then attach it via JavaScript, right? And CSS modules goes ahead and makes those class names unique. So as soon as this is started, you'll see that the class names now have a hash appended to them. So if I refresh this, there we go, now it looks correct. And as you can see, the class name is some total garbage, right? It's some total human unreadable garbage, which does not make any sense, but is completely unique, right? That class name, I can swear, is not going to be used anywhere else in your entire application, right? You cannot have a class name clash here, a naming clash anymore, because CSS module just goes ahead and makes them unique, which is very nice. It means I can name things more semantically. So let's figure out if those global styles are applied. Doesn't look like it. So CSS modules is very easy to move to, right? If you're thinking about maybe starting to scope your CSS to components, CSS modules is a great first step because all you have to do is just copy and paste your styling and import it into your components, which is very great. But at the same time, if you want to have a shared component library, for example, or if you want to do anything more advanced and have styling based on JavaScript, you can't do that with CSS modules, right? If you have a shared component library and you publish a CSS modules component up, all of your users have to have Webpack installed and they have to have all the loaders set up, which is a big pain in the butt, right? So here, to make CSS modules work with Create React App, I had to eject from Create React App and edit the config, right? I had to go manually into the Webpack config and enable CSS modules, which is obviously not something that you want to have to do, right? And so the solution to that is styled components, right? So if I do the same thing again, I go, I go git add dot git commit fix styling, git checkout, styled components. So to move that global CSS file to styled components, it's almost the same thing, except the copy and pasting is slightly different, right? So if we look in our index.js, we don't have any class names, we don't have anything at all, right? So let's figure out our wrapper. I want to show you the wrapper so you get a hang of what it does. So I'll copy and paste the styling, but without the class name. And then in my index.js, I'll go import style from style components, and then say const wrapper equals style.div, right? It's going to be this div right here. So I say style.div, and then pass a tag template literal. And now I literally just copy and paste that CSS in there, right? And replace the div down here with my component. So styled components is also almost copy and pastable, except not quite because I have to move it to JavaScript. But that means I now have the power of JavaScript. So I want you to do this again. So I'll give you another 10 minutes, do a git checkout styled components, and rework the entire application in styled components. And then I'll do it with you together. So I've already done the wrapper, but let me move over all of our styling to styled components. Let's start with the global styling. For global styling, styled components is a helper called inject global, which lets us inject global styles, right? Makes sense. So we'll inject our global styles, inject global, and that's it. So now we'll have our global styles, and then we've already done our wrapper. Let's create a title component. All we have to do is just say const title equals styled.h1, with the tag template literal, and then I just copy and paste the CSS in there, and render that component instead of our H1. So if we look at this in our browser, hopefully we don't have an error. Oh no, but we do have an error. God damn it. Let me restart Webpack. Let's go to the first tab, npm run start, and do the thing again. So style components lets you write actual CSS in JavaScript, right? You're not writing JavaScript objects, you're not writing JSON, you're not writing CSS as some other abstract representation, you're writing actual CSS. This is very nice because that means if you have designers that know how to CSS, they can write styled components, right? They don't need to learn any JavaScript, they don't need to learn anything special, they just write their CSS how they're used to, and then you make it into components, which works out really well. That's worked out super well in our team so far. Styled components not found. Well, that sucks. Let's hope it finds it. No. I'm gonna try npm installing styled components, but I kind of doubt that the internet will be fast enough. Maybe it's doing something. It's not very fast though. Resolving packages. I swear I put it into the dependencies. It's doing something. It's throwing lots of warnings. It's still doing something. I'll give it a chance. Still going. This is npm for you. Oh yeah, wait, we still need to move over the plot. Oh, I can do that meanwhile. I forgot about the plot component. So our plot here has a plot wrapper. Oh, and the after. Oh, I forgot so much code. So to do an after or any pseudo selector in styled components, you do it kind of like you do it in Sass or in Less. You just put an ampersand there, right? So I can say ampersand after, and put all of my after styles in there. And then for my plot wrapper, I'll have to copy and paste all of this. Go into my plot, and then say const wrapper equals style.div, and take all of this styling, make it without, oops, we don't need this class name here, with 100%, and then we want all of the main SVGs in there, or the first main SVG inside of our plot to have a certain background color, and to .pg also have this background color. We don't need to do, we need to put an ampersand there to do the nesting, and then in our plot, we just go wrapper, oops, wrapper rather than div. No. Wrapper and wrapper, and let's see if styled components is installed by now. Oh, we're getting there. Getting there. Maybe not. Never mind, we're not getting there. All right, let's see if I missed anything else. Oh yeah, the media query. So since styled components inject actual CSS, we can literally just write media queries, right? So our body should have a smaller font size on a small screen. So we go into our inject global call here and say, copy and paste this media query and say, body font size 12 pixel, nothing special going on, right? Just CSS. And then our plot wrapper should have a before in the same size. So if we go into our plot wrapper in plot.js, and we say at media screen and some max width, which I just now forgot. I'll copy and paste that later, and then I can say and before. Then let me figure out what the media query was. Media screen and. There we go. So now we also have our media queries in there. And that'll all just work, right? Contrary to inline styles and similar to CSS modules, you can use all of CSS in here, right? You don't have to rely on JavaScript to alias things. You can just use all of CSS. So now that we've npm installed everything, this should compile theoretically. Maybe I have to restart Webpack again. Let's hope this compiles. Please compile, God, please. Come on, Webpack, you got this. It's still compiling. It's not failed yet, so that's a good sign. Still compiling. Webpack isn't very fast, apparently. Okay, maybe it's stuck. I'll try restarting it, since that obviously didn't do anything. What? Okay then. Starting the development server. As soon as Webpack decides to finish compiling, we should have a styled application again. There we go, that worked. Okay, let me open that. No, that was the wrong thing. Right, and so we have a styled application now, and this is using styled components, right? So if we look in our dev tools, which I'll have to make a bit smaller because otherwise we can't see it. What you'll see is that our divs again have some random class names, right? Some random hash class names that aren't human readable. And then the way the CSS is injected, we look into our head, into the head of our document, and there's now a style tag here, right? And this style tag contains the corresponding styles for that component, for those components, right? So all of that is just injected as actual CSS, which is why we can use all of CSS to style our apps. And yeah, that's basically how styled components works. Did I forget anything? I don't think so. That's why I gotta do a space there. So this is a white background. I'm just fixing that. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Any questions? Barely see you.
Hey, Mark.
Hey.
What about custom components? Like if I
Yeah.
made my, can you hear me?
Yeah.
What if I made like a plot component of my own on React, and if I want to style it through this, like?
Sorry, what was the question? If you were to make...
If it's like a custom component, like a button component.
Yeah.
And I want to style that with styles components.
One of the important things one of the important things you have to do when you use style components is make your HTML tags components, right? So down here, rather than writing div and h1, I rendered components, right? Yeah. So these are sort of like primitives, right? And the nice thing about styled components is that you can extend any other component. So let's say I want to take this title, but I want to make it slightly different. Let's say I want to change the color, right? I can say const other title equals styled, call it as a function, and pass in the title. And then override some styles. I'll say color blue, right? And then if I render another title, it'll have a blue color. So I put another title here. Oops. Test. We'll now have a blue title. The thing about this syntax is that it'll work with any React component, right? What this does is it creates a class name and it passes it in. So what is here called title can be any React component, right? Styled components works with any third-party component library. It just passes in a class name, and as long as that's attached, it'll be styled.
All right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
There's a question way, oh wait, yeah. Go on.
Hey, so my question is, are you supporting styling a component within another component? So let us say title is within wrapper, and title needs to have its own few styles when it's within wrapper. So are you doing that?
So the question is how to style components nested within other components,
Within another
right?
component, yes, yes.
So another thing we added first in styled components version 2 was you can target other styled components, right? Because the class name is auto-generated, we can't put it in there, right? But what we can do is we can say, in our wrapper, because this example doesn't make any sense, in our wrapper we could say, hey, any title that is within a wrapper, right? We just interpolate it in. Any title that is inside of a wrapper component, change the color to red, right? And now any title within that wrapper component will have a color of red.
Yes, that answers my question.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you.
Random class names are unique, but wouldn't they create problems for debugging large-scale applications?
So the question is that the class names are hashes, right? So they don't correspond, they don't have any legible names. Is that the question?
No, if I want to debug any CSS through Google Developer Tools, you know, it's hard to find the elements,
Yep.
right?
So what Styled Components has is a Babel plugin. This requires you to create React app, which is why I don't have it installed. But what this Babel plugin does is it gives you the names of the components in your CSS class names, right? So if you use this Babel plugin, what you'll get is this, right? Rather than just saying random hash, you'll have the component name in the class name so you can find it again.
Okay, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
So you'll have to use this Babel plugin. That's just due to how JavaScript works. We don't have the name at runtime, so we have to do it with the Babel plugin.
Thanks.
No worries. The Babel plugin, just to note that, is also necessary if you want to do server-side rendering, because otherwise React will complain that the class names don't match. And the Babel plugin makes sure that they're deterministic at build time. Just a side note.
Hi, Max. I have one question. It's regarding performance. So doesn't it affect the performance? Because like it will be injecting all those CSS inside the page, and as well as like it might need some sort of like compilers to compile like what we have written in like as the style component support. So basically, like how does it like affects in the overall page rendering?
So the question was, how does it affect the overall page rendering, right?
Yeah.
How do we inject the CSS?
Yeah.
The nice thing about styled components is, oops, I deleted that. We know which components you actually use, right? So if you render a page with styled components, we only ever inject the styles that are actually used. We don't inject a single style that you don't use. That's super valuable when you're doing server-side rendering, because that means when you server-side render a page, you only ever get the critical CSS, right? You only ever get the CSS that is actually used on that page, nothing more, which is actually very nice.
So you mean to say that like only those styles will be used like to the particular components? Is it? Am I getting right?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So like basically, if one particular component is going to be rendered on a page, so you just use the particular CSS styles.
Yes, so only if the component is rendered, those styles are injected.
Yeah. Thank you.
No worries.
Hello. Hi, Max. So, do you have any opinion on the other alternatives like Glamorous and Emotion that have come up later after your efforts?
Yeah, so the question was, do I have any opinion on other CSS and JS frameworks? The answer is yes. There were a bunch of CSS and JS frameworks before styled components came along, right? We weren't the first ones to put CSS into JavaScript. We weren't by far not the first ones, right? We built upon a long, long list of libraries that did that before us. The thing that makes made styled components special was that it's CSS and JS for CSS folks, right? It doesn't let you write CSS as JavaScript objects. It doesn't try to fit CSS into the JavaScript notation. It just lets you write actual CSS. On top of that, it has this idea of binding styles to components, which works out really well in big, large-scale applications. So now people have taken that and they've added their own twist to it, right? So for example, there's Glamorous, which takes the idea of styled components but makes it work with objects, right? So if you like writing styles as objects, Glamorous is for you. They let you write styles as objects with a similar API. Glamorous is also a bit less strict about having to create components. They let you use attributes, which we don't. We're much more strict than Glamorous. And then now, very recently, a new library came out that's called Emotion. And Emotion is super cool because Emotion has the same API as styled components, but extracts the CSS at build time into a separate CSS file. And they do that with CSS variables to alias some JavaScript stuff. The issue with Emotion is that it's very new and it's not yet battle tested, right? There's a bunch of edge cases around static CSS extraction that might or might not work out in your application. So for example, in my application, I tried Emotion and it just broke a lot of things because it can't detect everything at build time. The sort of tip I would give you if you're thinking about using styles in JavaScript is just try different libraries out, right? Just go in and build a tiny application with 5 different libraries that look good to you and figure out which one works for you, right? It depends on your team, it depends on your app, it depends on your use case, which library fits or doesn't fit you. And I can't really suggest a blanket, solution to that. I hope that makes sense. Basically, evaluate them yourself. I really like styled components. I made it, so I'm totally biased towards styled components. But I would suggest you just try out all the libraries that you find cool and figure out which one's the best one for your use case. But obviously, that's going to be styled components, right, realistically. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah? I was wondering about the microphone. I was like, that seems very quiet.
Hello?
Hey, now I can hear you.
Yeah, great talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions about style components. First one is that would I be able to use this in vanilla JavaScript these days with ES6, not React specific?
Yes.
So what is the current roadmap for the cross-browser compatibility?
This is all valid JavaScript. There's no special syntax going on. This whole backtick thing is an ES6 standard. So as long as the code you're writing is ES6, you're fine, right? If you want to support browsers that don't support ES6, you'll have to transpile down to ES5.
That's just the standard way of writing it in ES6 with backticks and transpiling it back to ES5.
Yeah, so you can do that, but you don't have to. If your browsers support ES6, you're fine, right? This is valid JavaScript. This is not something we invented. This is actual valid JavaScript.
That's awesome. My second question is that there are different, when you are talking about writing style components in vanilla JS and HTML and CSS, we already have some stabilized and front-end naming convention methodologies like BEM, OCSS, Smash CSS. So do you think that we should, because as you mentioned, as you walk through your presentation, you said that with CSS, with inline CSS, basically style component checks all the checklist as compared to if you write code in BEM or OCSS. Do you think that it is the time to stop writing in those front-end naming conventions and start writing in style components, or should we port our code from BEM, OCSS to this style components?
The answer to that is that styled components is basically automatic BEM. The idea behind BEM is to avoid naming collisions, right?
Yeah.
Because CSS class names are global, what BEM does is it forces you to write in a very specific notation so that every class name is unique. But styled components in CSS modules and all of these other CSS and JS libraries do that automatically. They're kind of like automatic BEM, right? They give you BEM out of the box without you having to think about it, which is very nice because if you work in a big team, people can't make mistakes, right? People can't create another class name that already exists because the class names are auto-generated, that's it, right? So in a way, it's an evolution of those ideas, right? It takes those ideas, but it makes them automatic. Why should humans have to take care of making a unique class names if computers are much better at it, right? Why don't we just let the computers do it?
It's just like automation of BEM, right?
Kind of, yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks a lot. That answers all my questions. Great talk. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. Yeah, turn on the microphone maybe.
Hello.
There you
go. Hey Max, we have been using style components for a while now.
Yeah.
And yeah, awesome library. By the way, it has made our life very simple.
Thank you.
My issue with style component was that we also have Middle Eastern clients and we need to support RTL for them. When are you planning to bring that on? So what we are doing presently is we have a wrapper over the style components in which we do the RTL transitions when we are bundling for our Middle Eastern clients. But when is this possibly coming to style component?
What possibly coming to style?
RTL, right to left.
Sorry? Right to left. I don't know. Build it. What would that look like?
I actually have built it. I'll send you a link.
All right. I mean, it's been an issue. I haven't thought about that at all, to be honest.
So what we are doing presently is before bundling the JavaScript, we this is not working. Yeah, we convert all the margin left, so all the left literals to right and all the rights to left, so that we support RTLs for our clients who need it. But
that could probably happen. So did you build that as a Webpack plugin or as a Babel plugin, or how does that work?
Webpack plugin.
So does that exist?
We are using it. We build it for our own use case.
Is it open source?
No, it's not yet.
Well, then make it open source. There you go. Now you have a solution.
Okay.
I mean, if you've already built it, if you open source it, everybody else can use it as well, right? So then we don't have to build it anymore, which is super great.
Sure, we'll. Hello? Yeah, we'll ping you on that.
Sounds good.
Hey Max, hi.
Sorry.
Hey, was a great talk.
Thank you.
So I just had a couple of things. So at the expense of sounding nitpicky, in your self-made checklist, the final part was the wrapper component. And you know how hard it is when you have multiple wrapper components doing specific responsibilities for it. So assuming layout management and then style management and things like that, it makes that much more harder when you have to deduce what's going on inside a larger piece of code. Do you have anything in mind in terms of just moving away from wrapper components and just concentrating on making it, possibly achieving the last checkbox for us?
So, no. For the reason that I think that's a good thing, in the sense that because styled components forces you to make everything a component, everything becomes a lot more understandable, right? The issue I have with wrapper components is that it's just more components, right? It might be slightly slower to render. I've benchmarked it, and it's like if you render 50,000 wrapper components or 50,000 DOM nodes, the difference is like 10 milliseconds. So it's not super big. But really, having components be your unit of reuse makes a lot of sense, because then suddenly you can have components like a grid component, right? So you can go grid, rather than having a class name, we have a grid component, which is just a styled component. And then inside of that, we have a column component, right? For just an example, to show you what I mean. But that way, I can look at this component and I can sort of understand what the layout looks like, right? Which means I avoid a whole class of layout bugs because I know that this should have a column. And if I copy and paste this, that it should have 2 columns, right? And if it doesn't have that, I know that I need to fix my grid and column components. And I can pinpoint exactly where the issue is. Whereas if I were using class names, I'd have to figure out where's that class name applied, what exactly does it do what I want it to, and it's all very much harder. So I really like that part actually of being forced to create components. So I don't think we'll change that. If you don't like creating components for everything, if you're not a fan of that, there's lots of other CSS and JS library that don't have that property, right? So I'd encourage you to look around and figure out what works for you.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, hi Max, great talk. So currently we are trying out Fella theme provider.
Yeah.
What are your views regarding that?
Fella is great.
Okay. Also,
that's it? No.
Okay. Also, we support both CSS and writing, CSS and JS. Is it a good idea?
In what sense?
Yeah?
In what do you mean specifically? Why would it not be a good idea?
Sorry?
Why would it not be a good idea?
I'm just asking it.
Do you have any issues with it?
No, we do not have issues.
Well,
but is it a good idea?
Well, I mean, if it works, it works.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, I can't give a more specific answer to that. If it works, it works,
Hi, Max.
Yeah, where are you? Oh,
hey,
yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for style components because it's not a question. I've been using a lot of BEM, OCSS, PostCSS, SAS, and SUSE, and Compass, and been spent tons of years using multiple kinds of CSS libraries. Never made any sense. Style components was the first library that made any sense. It has improved my well-being on a day-to-day basis. I just want to thank you for this amazing library. It's pretty good. I also want to bear witness because if you haven't tried it out, you should really, really try it out. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, give him a round of applause. I appreciate that. By the way, this is probably a good idea to mention. If you're using an open source project and you like it, go let the people that make that open source project know. Because as somebody who makes a lot of open source projects, most of the things that I hear are bad things, right? Because most of the time, people just open issues and they go, there's a bug here, I need that feature, why are you so slow? And lots of negative things, right? But all the people that like it, they never say anything because why should they, right? Because they like it anyway, so why should they submit an issue? So this is not about style components, but go talk to the authors that makes open source projects that you use and tell them that you like them. They'll really appreciate it, all right? That's just as a side note. Yeah, thanks.
Hey Max, brilliant talk. I have a question. How can we leverage post-CSS with style components, especially for the vendor prefixes and new features with CSS first?
So a funny thing is that style components does all of that for you. So all of your CSS is automatically vendor prefix based on the browser. And then another thing people often ask me is, they have, for example, an existing application written in SAS, how can they move over to styled components? The thing is that JavaScript does most of the things that any preprocessor would do anyway, right? So variables are just interpolations. So I could say my font size variable is, I don't know, 1.5 em, and then I can just interpolate that here and say, hey, let's put a variable here, right? And I don't need to have a special preprocessor for that because it's already in JavaScript. Mixins are just functions, right? Mixins I can just replace with functions. There's one thing which SAS has, which JavaScript doesn't, which is color functions. So if you're using SAS, for example, or any other preprocessor, they often have these functions that you lighten or darken colors, that let you, do all sorts of those sorts of miscellaneous things that JavaScript doesn't. So we wrote a library for that called Polished. Polished basically implements those functions in JavaScript. So you have, for example, a darken function that you can import so that you can move your SAS application over from SAS to any CSS and JS library. This works with any CSS and JS library, and it'll just darken colors and lighten colors, and it has all of those functions. So in my mind, I don't even need any build step anymore, right? For my use case, that's it, because all I need is vendor prefixing, and all of the other features I need from a preprocessor, I already have in JavaScript. Yeah.
Hi Max, it was a good session and very helpful. I have one question regarding unit test. very particular to enzyme framework. So we have this shallow rendering wherein you recognize the component the way it's been given the name. How would style components behave in that case?
So there's two parts to that answer. The first, if you're doing something like end-to-end tests, this is another question I get asked quite often. If you're doing end-to-end tests, many people use class names as selectors, right? They say select that element with that class name, and then do something in their end-to-end test. So what we do at ThinkMill is we have a data end-to-end ID attribute, which we give an element a specific ID for end-to-end tests. And then for unit tests, we wrote this thing called jest-styled components, which we highly recommend using for testing styled components specifically, because it lets you have snapshot testing for your styles, right? So what you'll get is, rather than seeing this, which is not very helpful, you'll see this. You'll see which specific CSS has changed since the last time a component was updated. So that's what I use for unit testing styled components, right?
Hi, Max. So one of the problems that we have in the React community is that you can build out UI components, but then when you have to actually share it on NPM or something, then the styling part is very specific to the library that, so like you said, right, it can be either using less or a CSS, and that becomes a problem in the library which is using those components, because it has to set up the Webpack configurations and stuff. So how exactly does style components solve that? And
you don't need any specific build process.
So it's included in the runtime.
Yeah, it all happens in JavaScript. So if I were to take this wrapper component, for example, and publish it to NPM, it would just work, right? Users would just have to go import wrapper from whatever, import wrapper from my UI package, and then just use the wrapper. And the styling would automatically be injected at the right time, and it would automatically be split and everything.
Right. A second part to that is, so if we can use it like this, and say if you want to pass a custom class name to the component, then how would you do that? So in this case, the style component class and the custom class would both be applied, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
It's just a React component. So whatever React components do, styled components do, right? It doesn't. There's nothing special going on here. Yeah. So just attach a class name, and that's it. All right, if that's it, thank you very much. Oh wait, there's one more question.
Just one more question.
One more question. Let's do a last question.
Last question.
Hello. Yeah, great talk. So yeah, I just wanted to ask for a certain use case. For a lot of browser automation use cases, what a lot of people do is they actually wait for a certain CSS selector or class to load. Right, like for example, if I'm doing browser automation to probably download an Excel sheet when it's done, or like if I'm scraping data off a dashboard when the entire dashboard has loaded. So a lot of people, what they do is they actually wait for a certain CSS selector that, okay, once this has been loaded, I'm sure that, okay, the page has been loaded, now I'll go ahead with the network call. Because if I make a network call before the page is loaded, then it'll return me with undefined data, right? Yeah. So like if like those people, they start using style components, or in a lot of cases where scraping is done based on these elements, and the class name, as we have seen, like hashes are being created. So do you believe that the entire idea of scraping something, or waiting for a certain selector based on that, has to move to that E2E ID that you suggested? Or do you think there is a workaround? Like, do those people, like those people would certainly not support this, right? They don't, like if I'm making a website, I don't have to take care of the guy who's going to scrape it for me. Yeah. I'll just use the React style components. But for the guy who was, either scraping it or automating that process, the entire process now kind of has a loophole in it, because the class name and everything is being generated as a new thing every time. So do you think that that is a problem?
No. Because if you use the Babel plugin, what you can do is you'll end up with class names that look like this, right? Which means you can still use selectors to wait for them, right? So rather than waiting, for example, for a .button class name, you just wait for an attribute selector where the class name starts with sc-button, right? This selector waits until there's an element with a class attribute where the class attribute starts with sc-button, right? Because After that, there's some random hash, right? There's some garbage right here which you don't know, right? There could be anything there.
Yeah.
It's like something very random, right? Which is horrible because you can't scrape it. But
like the problem with this approach would be like all of the buttons, they'd have that SC button preceding them, right? If I wanted to wait for a specific one, do you think that is possible? Because all of those buttons would have this SC button and a random hash. And if I wait for the ones which are preceding SC button, I might, get the wrong element. So,
but that happens with class names anyway, because then if you wait for a dot button, you'd also have all of the buttons, right? If you want a specific one, you have to target it more specifically,
Yeah,
which means you need an ID either way, right? There's no difference there between styled components and normal CSS.
That is true, yeah. That makes sense. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
No worries. All right, that's it. Thank you very much.